all kinds of variations in between them. And the first is a group called the Judaizers. The second and much, much later group, I'll just call them the Darbyites. And then you have covenant theology, or the Reformed view of God's people. And it is worth taking some time to look at these, because these three groups are still arguing today over this question. They're brothers and sisters in the faith. Okay, I mean, this is an inter-family debate. Okay, no condemnation here, but it's important to understand. So let's look at them one at a time. Now, the first group here, the Judaizers, were the group of Christians like the ones up in Antioch who, during the New Testament period, believed that Christianity, or that Christ was a Jewish religion still. And Gentiles can join if they want to, but they need to be circumcised to become Jews in order to be saved. And this is what we might call faith plus circumcision. Okay, so to the question, who are the people of God? The answer of the Judaizers was, it's still Israel. Nothing has changed. We are the people of God. And Paul mentions these folks, the Judaizers, in his letters, several of them, but especially in the letter to the Galatians, because they were very influential there. And the Judaizers were pressuring people. Even Peter got influenced by them to stop hanging out with the Gentile Christians because they hadn't been circumcised. And Paul even rebukes Peter for it very, very openly in his letter to the Galatians in chapter 2. You can read about it there yourself. But basically, they were causing a real problem in the early church. And Paul was constantly pushing back on them in his epistles. And at one point, he got so fed up with them, he said, I wish you would go ahead and emasculate yourselves. In other words, if circumcision is so important to you, why don't you just go ahead and cut it all off? I mean, that's harsh, man. Paul was not mincing words. But why was Paul so harsh on this subject? Well, it's because the Judaizers were, in his mind, I believe, adding something to the gospel. Yes, you can be saved by faith, but you also have to be circumcised. But see, for Paul and the rest of the Jerusalem Council, the gospel is faith plus nothing. It's a gift of grace received by faith alone. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Okay, so the Judaizers, that's their view, that the people of God is Israel, and they didn't really last too long in the annals of history, though there are still some fringe groups that exist today that may hold to a similar view as the Judaizers, but they're not a very large group anymore today, or don't have much influence. The second group, and much, much more modern view of the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles, comes from a British clergyman known as John Nelson Darby in the 19th century. And he said more or less that the Jews and the Christians represent two different peoples of God existing at the same time. Okay, so there's two separate tracks. There's the Jewish track, which still maintains its relationship to God through sacrifices and Mosaic law and circumcision. And then there's a track for the church, who are not under the law of Moses, but under grace. And although there were a few random theologians who sort of shared bits and pieces of his view in the century or two before him, Darby is really considered the father of this view because he's the one who developed it the most fully. And he came to these conclusions about the people of God while he was recovering from a horse riding injury in Ireland. But when he unveiled this view, which had never to this point really been fully developed, to the Europeans, especially the continental Europeans down on the continent, they didn't respond to it right away. I mean, it was such a unique and different view. It was so fringe that it really didn't get much steam. But then eventually he traveled over to the U.S., and as is often the case, Americans will jump on any new fad. That's our thing. And the view took hold and grew like wildfire, especially after a guy named Cyrus Ingersoll Schofield printed a Bible called the Schofield Reference Bible, which was mass-produced in the States. You can still find them today basically everywhere, in almost every home in America. Even in Germany, you can find them, the Schofield Bible. And it was filled with notes and comments from Darby's unique theological perspective. And then eventually, Darby's view came back to Europe through powerful evangelism and American pastors like Dwight L. Moody, who preached to thousands, as well as other preachers and evangelists who were convinced that Darby was onto something. And it finally found a home here in Europe as well. And I don't mean to disparage these guys. I mean, these are great men of faith, brothers in Christ. We're on the same team, okay? Please don't hear me saying anything except that. It's just important for me to explain why and how we differ from some of our brothers on these important, but, non-essential Christian doctrines. Okay, so we can say that the Darbyite view, or more commonly known as today as the dispensational view, sees two separate, distinct peoples of God who relate to God in two very different ways. You have the Jews, and they have the law, and the church, which is under grace. And although we love our dispensational brothers and sisters, and we do, I have full fellowship with them in Christ. We both love Christ, no doubt, but I could not disagree with them on this point more than I do now about the subject of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. And I'll just name a few reasons why. I don't want to take all our time on this discussion, but it's important to know because of this view really does undo so much of what we've been talking about in the last 9 videos and the fulfillment of Israel's history in Christ. Okay, let me see if I can explain what I mean by that, and then you can make your own conclusions. So first of all, we know from our timeline and our study of the Old Testament story thus far that this has been God's plan from the very beginning, to rescue men and women from all nations of the earth in Israel. Genesis 22:18. And in your offspring, this is the promise to Abraham, in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. This promise was given way back here to Abraham. The Gentiles are not saved apart from Israel, but in Israel. However, according to Darby's view, the church is something completely separate. If you've ever seen the dispensational graft of the new covenant, which we have here in front of you, you'll see that this is a picture of their view of from Christ until the end times. They also have a view of the Old Testament, but this is the New Testament times. And don't worry too much about this. We're actually going to come back to it in the next video. But what's interesting is you'll always see that the church is in parentheses. Can you see that there? They're in parentheses because they are completely separated and have nothing to do with the Jewish story. The Old Testament story just sort of jumps over the church and then is picked up again in the millennium with Israel. But as we just read, God promised to save the world in Israel, which was one of the 5 promises given to Abraham at the very beginning. And that promise was fulfilled in the death and resurrection of Christ. The Gentiles have been saved in Israel, not apart from them, but in them, with them, and through them. Okay, so listen to what Jesus said in John 10 once. He says, I have other sheep. Okay, that's the Gentiles. I must bring them in as well, and they will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. We, Gentiles, are the other sheep that are not of this fold, not of the Jewish nation. Now, did you hear that? Notice, not 2 flocks with one shepherd. There will be one flock with one shepherd. Jews and Gentiles, one flock. Paul points this out over and over in the New Testament himself, and as a matter of fact, he calls this the great mystery, which has been hidden for ages, but is now revealed in Christ, that the Jews and Greeks are now one in Christ. Ephesians 3:6, he says, this mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body, not 2 bodies, the same body, and partakers of the promises of Christ through the gospel. And then in his letter to the Galatians, he goes even further, and he says, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, of course, Paul knows that there are men and women in the world. He also knows that there are people with Jewish heritage and Greek heritage. That's not his point. His point is that now the people of God are defined by faith in Jesus rather than by the bloodline of Abraham. That's the change in the new covenant, making them one in Christ. Regardless of heritage, regardless of gender or social status, we are one in Christ. Now, let me look at just one more with you, because I really want you to see this. It's important. Paul says in Ephesians 2, remember that you, he's speaking to the Gentiles, that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants and promises, having no hope and without God in the world. Okay, that's us. That's the Gentiles. We were separated from Israel. And then he says in verses 13 to 16, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one. And then in verse 15, abolishing the law and commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in the place of two. What two is he talking about? The Jew and the Greek. The two have now become one. There are not two peoples of God, but there is only one people of God. More than that, listen to this, what he says. I hope maybe you caught it. He says the Mosaic law is abolished. It doesn't carry on for the Jews while the Christians do their own thing by grace. No, the old covenant Jewish way is gone. The temple is gone. The festivals are gone. The sacrifices are gone. They were just road signs pointing to Christ, but now they have been fulfilled in him. Let me just go back there for a second, because I think I probably need to rephrase how I said that. That was poor wording, and I'm sorry. When I say that they're gone, I don't mean that they're abolished. When I say they're gone, I mean they're fulfilled in Jesus. They're filled up. They're embodied by him. They're actually not gone. They're still here, but they're embodied now by Christ. Christ is the fullness of all those things. And now, all those who have faith in Jesus Christ are united to that one fulfiller of all those things. They're united people of God in Christ, whether Jew or Greek. Okay, and this is what covenant theology believes. This is how we see it today, that the people of God is the church. And I don't mean by that non-Jews. I mean by that Jews and Gentiles who have put their faith in Christ. Why do I believe that? Because the New Testament has told us that the people of God are one flock, one man in place of two, the same body, made one, Jew and Greek, one in Christ. This doesn't mean that that Jews should reject their heritage or deny their Jewishness. Some people have accused covenant theology of that. Just the opposite. Okay? They have reason to celebrate their heritage. They are our older brothers in the faith. They hold a place of honor as such. Paul even had to warn the Gentiles against the arrogance of the little brother. No, in the New Testament, it always says to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. So please don't hear me saying that Jewish heritage is unimportant. The point I'm trying to make is that in Christ, I think this is the point Paul is making, there are new things that bind us together in this one body. Now it's not the blood of Abraham, but it's the Spirit. It's baptism. It's the Lord's Supper. And most importantly, and above all, it's faith in Christ that unites us. In other words, Jerusalem is no longer the center of the world. Jesus is the center of the world. He's the center of the cosmos. So Paul says, for example, in Colossians 2:16, therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink or regard to festivals or new moon or Sabbath. Okay, so in other words, go ahead and celebrate your Jewish heritage. That's important. Go ahead and celebrate your Greek and American and German cultural and historical heritages. But just recognize that these are no longer the symbols or celebrations or signs of the new covenant. And the universal church of Jesus Christ is found all around the world and is united by faith in him. He's the fulfillment of all those Old Testament signs. So Paul continues, they are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Again, making that point, Jesus is now the center. He is the one to whom all those signs and symbols and festivals were pointing. Okay, well, one criticism that the Darbyites are brothers and sisters, okay, like I've been saying, this is an interfamily debate. I'm not condemning anyone. Please don't hear me condemning. I love my brothers and sisters. But I just want you to understand why we believe what we believe in the Nick. That's all. There's plenty of other videos you can watch to understand their side of the argument, and you should do that. My goal is to simply help explain what we believe here at the Nick. And one of their criticisms of the covenant view is that it replaces Israel with the church. They say that we teach something called replacement theology, because it sounds like we're saying that the Old Testament Israel was the people of God then, but now this new group takes over called the church, and they've replaced the Jews and made the nation of Israel obsolete and irrelevant. I'm doing my best to summarize their view. You should probably hear it from them. But I think they would say that our view makes all of the Old Testament promises to Israel null and void. And that's a problem for them. They want to know, and rightly so, honestly, they want to know, what about all this stuff? And the law and the priests and the temple and the promises and the prophets. Jesus came and then all that stuff is just gone? That can't be, right? Because on many occasions, if you've read your Old Testament, God gave promises that were to last forever. And so they can't simply just be gone. And I actually agree with them on this point. That would be truly a problem, right? Because God made irrevocable promises to Israel in the Old Testament. No, that cannot be the case. The church cannot make all of Israel's promises and ceremonies and rituals obsolete. That would be replacement theology, and I condemn it along with them. But you see, this is why our previous 9 videos are so important. Because all that Jewish stuff, if you want to call it that, is not gone. It's fulfilled in Christ. And this is a massive difference. You have to understand this. Jesus is the temple, and the church are the stones in that temple. Jesus is the final priest, the final prophet, the final king. Jesus is the lampstand and who brings light to the world. He is the bread of life. He is the wash laver for sinners so that they can come to God's presence. That stuff and those Old Testament promises are not gone. They are not replaced. They are fulfilled in Christ. And don't even misunderstand the word fulfilled, because that can also lead us astray. Because I don't mean by that finished, like I fulfilled that task, it's done, it's over with. No, I'm not saying we don't need those Jewish sacrifices anymore. We don't need those high priests anymore because Jesus fulfilled them. They're old concepts and they're now obsolete. No, that's not what we're saying. When we say that Jesus is fulfilling these things, it means that he is currently now filling those roles for us now. He is the embodiment of high priest. He is Son of David. He is the judge, the sacrifice, and so on. It's kind of like saying that Olaf Scholz fulfills the position of chancellor. It doesn't mean he did away with it. No, he's fulfilling that position right now. And Jesus is fulfilling all those roles and symbols and shadows of the Old Testament in himself right now. Okay? So this is not replacement theology. This is fulfillment theology. The church does not replace Israel. No, the church is the fulfillment of Israel's story in Christ. Darby drew too strong a division between the old and new covenants. Maybe you remember this slide from video number 5. The Darbyites often see the old and new covenant as completely different things, like comparing apples and oranges. God's Old Testament covenant people were something entirely different than his new covenant people. He deals with the Jews through the law and with his church by grace. That's totally different, 2 different things. But you see, in covenant theology, we see all of the Old Testament leading up to the fullness of time, as Jesus called it, and in which he would fulfill all those old covenant types and shadows. They were all incomplete, imperfect shadows, and he is the reality of them. And so we would say that the old covenant is more like an apple seed, and in Christ we have the fullness, the full-grown tree. In other words, the old covenant and the new covenant are not two different stories, but one and the same story that has reached its fullness and its maturation in the new covenant with Christ